COVID-19. Is there normal? Well, no such thing. So today, of course, pausing and looking at the pharmaceutical industry, some of the challenges and some of the ways in which to manage those challenges. And as you can see today, we'll be looking at current problems with freight services, then focusing on pharmaceutical exports, the relationship with your freight forwarder, making use of available services, reconfiguring packing and order quantities, and rethinking risk. And we're delighted today to be joined by our guest presenter, Dr. Roberto Bergami. And of course, you've come across Roberto before in this series. He's an assistant professor at the University of South Bohemia. Roberto has over 20 years of industry experience in international trade, including roles in logistics, customer service, sales, marketing, and product management. And he also has over 25 years of teaching experience in the private sector as well as university sectors. And Roberto also, amongst other things, has a long history of having worked in the pharmaceutical sector. So without further ado, Roberto, I'm going to pass over to you and welcome.
Thank you, Collins, and good afternoon to everybody. And I'll start off by, I guess, pointing out what probably everybody knows, where we are with capacity constraints, especially in air freight. We do live in a world, or we have lived in a world of interconnected lean supply chains, where the just-in-time systems have proven too fragile in times like these of massive disruption. People are running around saying this is the biggest disruption that we've experienced, etc. Perhaps they've forgotten about the world wars, but we don't want to be necessarily having another one of those. But certainly in recent peaceful times, this has been the biggest disruption the world has experienced. It certainly caught everyone by surprise. And some of the work that had been done to make sure that we optimized things that we were doing in business processes with the introduction of things like just-in-time systems, etc. These events in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic have certainly tested those theories, and they have proven to some degree that, the theory and the practice don't necessarily always match up, and certainly there needs to be a rethink. And so the current situation means that increased buffer stocks are almost a must. I was listening to a few webinars being offered by some US freight forwarding and logistics companies in the last few weeks. And the biggest message that everyone gave, apart from visibility that I'll come back to in a moment in relation to the supply chain, was really telling everybody, just increase your buffer stocks. You really need to increase your buffer stock because we don't know where this is going. We are seeing variants. So, we had the original strain and then we've got the alpha and now we've got the kappa, and I don't know what other Greek letter in the alphabet we're going to come up with next, but sure as heck, the virus, like everything else, wants to live and it'll mutate and it'll do things. And until we can get on top of this, and I don't see this happening in the next few months, we are not really going to know what's going to go on. So in as difficult as it might be to make those changes, I think increasing buffer stocks wherever possible are a good risk mitigation strategy for organizations to have. You need to respond to market demands as quick as possible, and when you don't have any buffer stock as fallback positions, etc., you're not going to be able to. It's as simple as that. And so we need to rethink also do we make the stock or make to order in uncertain times? The make to order bit with the just in time works well when the system is perfect, but the system is not perfect at the moment. And so in uncertain times, make the stock wherever possible might actually turn out to be a lot better in the longer term, because you just don't know what's going to happen around the corner. It's as simple as that. And we need to have an increased focus on managing our costs and risks all over again. The 5 main points that I want to touch on briefly this afternoon are forwarders as partners, not enemies, making the best use of available services, taking an order quantity reconfiguration, rethinking risk management for delivery terms, the Incoterms 2020, and updating force majeure contract clauses. Can I have the next slide, please, Collins? Current problem with freight services, the IATA figures of April 2021 on a global monthly demand, the cargo tonne per kilometre was up 12% compared to April 2019, but capacity remains 97% below pre-COVID levels because of grounded passenger flights. So the lower deck of the aircrafts that we normally travel upon as we go jet setting around the world prior to COVID-19 was a boon to getting your product overseas. But given that those have been grounded, then all of that capacity has been lost. Although dedicated freighter capacity rose by 26.2% in April, then belly cargo capacity decreased by 38.5%. So we've got a net loss in capacity. Some airlines have reconfigured some of their aircraft so that they're able to carry some cargo on the top deck where the passengers are by lashing things down and fastening them on top of seats, etc. But few and far between. Certainly not everyone's done that. And the depressed state of air freight movements at the moment is really straining the supply chain. The competitiveness against sea freight has improved. Air cargo rates are stabilised, but container rates keep going up. So longer supply delivery time when economic activity increases makes air cargo more attractive, obviously. The federal government did offer an international freight assistance mechanism. It's in place, it should read than on pace, for selected routes and carriers to assist exporters. You can find that information out. And that sort of provides some sort of buffer, some sort of assistance for people, but it's only on dedicated route, it's not a blanket application to everyone, everywhere, on all potential available services. Can I have the next slide, please, Collins? And the next one again. Okay, so in terms of export of medical and pharmaceutical products from Australia, we increased to 226 in April 21 from 90 million in March 21. So we've had a bit of a bounce back in that situation. And certainly from a country's perspective, we certainly punch above our weight in terms of where we sit and in terms of our composition and relative economic strength, etc., around the world. We do quite well as a small nation, comparatively speaking, in relation to our pharmaceutical exports. There has been some increase of particular products, and there's also been capacity constraints that have resulted as the need for things like personal protective equipment, etc., have taken priority over other things, and that's kind of put a bit more squeeze on availability, etc. We've had an expansion in demand for cellular therapies, vaccines, blood products in the biopharmaceutical industry, and that's been driving the growth in that market around the world. The extension of cold chain logistics via air is the fastest way of shipping pharmaceutical with negligible product damage. And we need to remember also that if we're looking at biological products, pretty much all of them have got limited shelf life, some more limited than others. And so the need for speed, for want of a better expression, is also something else that drives people towards the air freight rather than the sea freight routes, coupled with the cold chain requirements, etc. And enhancement in the production rate of biologicals, hormone medications, vaccines, complex proteins, and temperature-specific byproducts requiring cold chain shipment has also seen significant growth in that product market. And again, the cold chain component for those products that require it is absolutely vital to maintain product integrity. And so again, we see the shift towards quicker movement in terms of logistics movements rather than slower ones. Typically, when we're looking at biological products, vaccines and the like, we are looking at low weight, high value cargo. And so the freight rate component on a percentage basis is nowhere near as critical as if, for argument's sake, you were shipping out concrete bricks. Stupid example, but just to bring the point home. So can I have the next slide, please? Just a refresher, and before leaving Australia, there are rules and regulations in this nation, as there are in all the other nations around the world, controlling medicines, for want of a better description. So you need to make sure that your product complies with the regulations set up by the TGA. If you hold your product under a patent, you might need to approach IP Australia to cover your IP overseas as well. Remembering that the patent that you get here, if it's just a local patent, it will only protect you here within the jurisdiction of Australia, not outside it. So there's some risk management to be thought about in that respect. If you're exporting plant or animal material, then AQUIS website for specifics on exportation. And if you're looking at something that's got chemical components, it might be of a hazardous nature, and that might be hazardous to humans, animals, the environment, or any of the above in combinations, etc., then CASA, or if you're doing things by air, then it'll be the IATA regulations for the transport of dangerous goods, or the IMO if you're going by sea. And definitely your logistics providers should be up to scratch with all of this information in relation to dangerous and hazardous material to be transported, because that's their bread and butter. If they don't know those things, you'd have to question why they're in that business and why you'd want to use them. Next slide, please, Collins. The extension of cold chain logistics is the fastest way, as I said before, and this is going to give you the greatest chance of making sure that the integrity of your product remains as is. And I think for those of us that have been or are involved in things to do with biological products, then most people are well aware of the fact that temperature changes cause deleterious effects on the products. They make them not behave like they ought to, and that could have severe consequences if they are going to be injected into humans or animals, for that matter. And so we need to be really, really careful, and we need to make sure that we have strong, robust cold chain logistic services right across from the time that the product leaves our warehouse until the time that it arrives in the customer's warehouse. And it's sometimes it's a challenge, but it's one that needs to be met. So we have enhancement in the production rate of biologics, hormones, etc., and a whole bunch of other products that are coming up and emerging in the market, temperature-specific byproducts requiring cold chain shipment. So we look at the current situation as an example, and we look at the Pfizer vaccine, and we look at the way that it has to be transported. That's a challenge in itself. The way that it has to be kept once it's received is a continuing challenge, and then it has to be administered. And so there are temperature requirements right along the chain for that to happen. And some of those are challenges because of the extreme low temperature that the vaccine needs to be kept at while it's traveling. The market for pharmaceutical products, biologicals, as well as other pharmaceutical products, is really dominated worldwide by North America and Europe. And that's because they have the greatest amount of manufacturing and research activity than anybody else around the world has. And they are continually looking at making improvements. And so, there's a lot of research that goes on. And if you have a look at the logistics index, you'll find that the United States and the European Union are right up there in terms of world rankings in those sorts of areas. And they certainly have introduced quite a lot of advanced technologies, software solutions, etc., particularly when we come down to the area of visibility in the supply chain, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Can I have the next slide, please? So vitally important that standards are maintained and traceable along the entire supply chain. Cornerstone of shipping pharmaceutical products, hygiene. Definitely, we're talking about things that are going to be injected into people or animals, as it may be. And, we all know that good medicine is great, but bad medicine can certainly do a lot of damage and cease people's lives. So we don't want any of those sorts of things. So we need to be very careful about the husbandry, if you like, in terms of how we deal with things. And most organizations that have got anything to do with biological products and pharmaceutical products, medicines, etc., do have very high standards. Certainly in Australia we do, but you can't necessarily predict how the product is going to travel, what it will be subjected to during its transport. And so there's something to be thought about in terms of the way that the product is packed and shipped. We also need to make sure that we have got some security issues associated with that, because there should be limited access to products like pharmaceuticals. The simple reason for that is that we want to make sure that they don't end up in the wrong hands. And we also want to make sure that the way that the material is handled is not compromised, because that may lead to a substandard product reaching its final destination, which is not what we want. Can I have the next slide, please? Temperature, as I talked about before, the reference there are 55 to 77, but if you're looking at vaccines, most of those are between 2 to 8 degrees, but most of the over-the-counter preparations, things like aspirins and stuff, recommended storage temperature is typically below 25 degrees. And, as we're on the southern part of the world, in the southern hemisphere, if we're exporting to the northern hemisphere, then we're going to do things like crossing the equator and going into areas which are extremely hot. And so we need to think about the fact that we need to protect the product from those extremes of heat. And we need to really make sure that our cold chain or our cool chain, depending on which one we use, is really robust and it can stand the test of transport. And in that respect, exporters need to make sure that they have investigated thoroughly the routes that they're going to use to get product from A to B, how it's going to travel, how long it's going to be in transit, and under what conditions it's likely to be under. As I said before, if you expose a product to temperature storage outside its parameters, whether you freeze it when it's not supposed to be frozen, or whether you let it heat up where it's not supposed to be heated up, then the consequences for the product integrity might be dire, and the result from administering products which are outside the parameters may end up with some severe consequences for the people or the animals that are going to be injected with them or are going to be ingesting those products. So we need to be really, really careful. I can't stress it enough. Examination and record keeping, I think there's a pretty good system worldwide, generally speaking, of making sure that we've got traceability. And so that wherever it is that the product goes, records are kept. Records are kept as to who has been administered with what. And part of that is really risk management longer term. So in the unusual circumstance, but it happens from time to time, where we have either a product recall or an alert, then we know the people that we need to contact and we can trace things back. And so, and there have been things in the past that haven't quite gone right, not necessarily because people have done things wrong, but a newer disease might have emerged. And by the time that it's discovered and by the time that the realization hits home, the fact that product may have been administered to people and there was no diagnostic means of detecting that virus, bacteria might have been present in whatever biological product there was, then the traceability issue becomes vitally important to get back to people who may have been exposed to those untoward situations. So next slide, please. The leading pharma freight forwarders and shippers in the international pharmaceutical space, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are all the main ones: DHL, Kuehne+Nagel, Schenker, FedEx, and UPS. And some of these offer specialized services. Well, Courier is another one. They offer specialized services for the pharmaceutical sector in particular. And they do, just to varying degrees, they do guarantee that the product will be treated and stored in accordance with its requirements during its transport while it's in their charge. One of the things that we need to remember is the fact that whilst the goods are being transported, certainly in the air freight situation, with the exception of very specific circumstances, the product isn't going to be stored the way you want it if cold chain is required. So as an example, vaccine that might require 2 to 8 degrees storage temperature, it's not going to be 2 to 8 degrees in the aircraft. It just doesn't travel at that temperature. The mix of products that are in the belly of the aircraft just don't allow it to be. I mean, if you chartered the whole aircraft, yeah, sure, but you don't have that. You've got all sorts of products in there. So you may have products that require refrigeration. You might have products that require to be frozen. You might have products that cannot be frozen, etc. So the average in-flight temperature is understood to be somewhere in between 12 and 14 degrees. And if you've got product that needs to be kept between 2 and 8, well, 14 is definitely higher than 8. And so you've got some issues on there. And so you need to compensate with that by the way that you pack the product for transport, etc. And I'll give you some examples about those things in a moment. So if I could have the next slide, please. Word on importing country regulations. I think it's probably fair to say that if you don't know what the importing country regulations are, you're really well and truly behind the 8 ball. There is no worldwide standard which is exactly the same, although we have the WHO requirements, which are sort of kindly loosely followed by different nations. We've got different standards and different things. So sometimes we have mutual recognition agreements between different nations. And so we've got one with the European Union and Australia, but other times we don't. And sometimes things can just sort of change quite quickly from a geopolitical perspective rather than a scientific perspective sometimes. And each one of the nations around the world, you know, we have sovereignty. And so each nation can decide what it wants and how it wants it. And it's up to us to comply. All of this information needs to be researched way before you go into the country and start touting your product to be sold. You need to make sure that you really have met the importing country requirements, particularly in the medical scene, pharmaceutical sector, because they are quite specific on that. And Australia has got its own as well, and some people can criticise those, but as I said before, each nation is sovereign and they can decide whatever it is that they want for the product to be sold, marketed and distributed within the confines of their jurisdiction. So you've got a raft of regulatory bodies that are on there, but you know, each nation has got its own, and so whichever market you go into, I would suggest that probably the first point of call would be have a look at the regulation and the legislation and make sure that you're going to be able to comply with those, whatever they may be. Next slide, please, Collins. Next section, I'll talk about the relationship with the freight forwarder. And your freight forwarder is your ally. They're not meant to be your enemy. They are meant to be an extension of your shipping distribution area. That's what they're supposed to be. So you need to develop a deep, meaningful relationship with them. It's a win-win situation. You need them and they need you. And really that's the way that it works. So you should be able to work with more than one freight forwarder or a carrier. Simply because apart from the fact that, as I said down the bottom, you may be able to negotiate better deals playing one off against the other. But also what you'll find is that typically they all have strengths in different areas because of their footprint from a business perspective in relation to where they operate. And sometimes they may have agency agreements that might be sub-agency agreements, etc. And you've got third, fourth and fifth parties involved in areas where they don't have the strength. But in areas where they do have the strength, they may have their own presence, or they may have very long alliances with established counterparts in the other place. And so there's some solid foundation for you to work with, and you can expect some serious service provision by these people. You know, somebody can tell you, oh, we're experts everywhere in the world and we can reach anywhere in the world. And you can, but I would still probably say to varying degrees. You'd have your strength in particular areas, or be it because of your business history or be it because of the way that the business has developed recently or things have changed, mergers, acquisitions, all of those sorts of things. So really explore where their strength areas are. If you get a good forwarder, a logistics provider, they ought to be able to tell you upfront, our strength is in these areas. These are our corridors that we operate in, and we are really, really strong in there. We can provide absolute best level service that you can, and we are certain that we can meet all of your requirements. And they should also be able to say to you, we are not so strong in these areas. Yeah, we can do the job, but our star corridors are these ones, whatever they might be. So they might be concentrating on the US, or it might be the EU, or it might be parts of Asia, but not just necessarily all of them. And if you get to a situation where you find someone that's honest enough to tell you that, then you're onto a potentially solid partnership longer term. They're not trying to just sell you the moon because they can, or they think they can. They're actually telling you how it is, which is important. Building trust and building deep, meaningful relationships is what you want longer term. Next slide, please. Oh, actually, could you go back one? Sorry. I just had the example down there that I skipped over. I was involved some years ago in setting up a nationwide distribution chain for a wholesaler that the company I was working for were picked up in New Zealand. And I was really able to do that only because of the freight forwarder that I had, who had very strong arrangements with their counterpart customs broker in New Zealand. And so it essentially became one seamless transaction. So the customer would place their order for the whole of New Zealand, and they had 24 distribution depots that they were doing business out of. So 24 brick and mortar stores scattered across the North and the South Island. And what we would do is we would put all of the North Island's business in-house consolidated, and we would ship everything into Auckland. And the customs broker would clear the consignment as one consignment, and the parcels were already packed with the different stores' names and addresses on it. They would deconsolidate that consignment and do domestic delivery. The customer was paying for the duties and import taxes, and we were paying for everything else except that. And it worked out like a charm. And we were doing the same for the South Island, where we would be dropping things off into Christchurch, and then it would be distributed. And so we would get the late evening flights into New Zealand. So they would arrive early hours of the morning. They had a 24/7 operation. So they would clear overnight, and the stuff would be delivered in the morning to the stores. And so we typically had less than 24-hour turnaround in supplying the product to the distributor in New Zealand. The local competition couldn't do anything less than 2 days. We were doing it in 1 day or less from Melbourne, which is pretty good. But the reason we're able to do that is because of the intimate, in inverted commas, relationship, business relationship that we developed with the freight forwarder and the customs broker at the other end. We were all singing from the same sheet of music, and we're all singing the same song. Next slide, please. To talk to the operation guys, I found that actually quite important and quite revealing in my dealings with the service providers that I was responsible for when I was in the logistics part of my life. And yeah, sales staff are great. And yep, I used to be a salesman, so I can't talk too much badly about those because I was one of those. But the operations guys are really where you get the information. The sales guys don't handle your product as such. They're there to sell a service. They understand some of it, but the operations guy are the nitty-gritty. They're at the cold face. They know exactly what's going on. You need to find out what sort of services they have, whether they've got licensed premises, depending on what sort of product you've got that might require specific location, etc. And you need to have a look at their cold chain capabilities and whether they operate a 24/7 operation or not, because all of those things are going to have an impact in the type of service that they have and the sort of service level that you may expect or that you may demand. They are there as a service function. They are there to service your needs. You have to determine what your needs are, and they have to meet them or not, as the case may be. And there's nothing wrong with saying sorry, but we don't think that you're going to be able to satisfy our requirements. It's part and parcel of the whole thing. So I was pleasantly and unpleasantly surprised as I cycled through a number of freight forwarders and logistics providers during that part of my career where I was responsible for that part of the operations. And yeah, it was quite amazing and quite revealing to find that what the salesperson had been telling me that the company could do on inspecting their premises, it was a complete opposite of what was promised. So, things like cold chain requirements that were sworn black and blue were there. Well, where are they? Well, we're actually using the guys down the road to hold your things in their fridge. Excuse me. Like, sorry, that just doesn't work. So you need to have a look at that. And, at the same time as you're visiting the premises and getting to know people, you're developing the personal rapport. And so you get to know each other. And it really does help. It's still humans doing business, not machines. And so it really does help to develop a personal relationship in a business sense. And if you are serious about things and you really want to get to some deep, meaningful business relationships, then what you may want to consider is actually doing a staff swap, some of your operation staff with their operation staff. I did that once. And I can tell you that it paid back itself 100-fold. It was only a couple of days, so we've got a staff from the freight forwarding mob to come into us, and one staff at a time. We've got 3 staff, 2 days, and they cycled through. And then my staff went out there and worked with them for 2 days, one at a time, so that we wouldn't have too much disruption to our normal daily operations. And it just changed completely the way that my staff and their staff interacted with each other. They actually understood what was required from a service provider's point of view. And my staff could also understand the limitations and the challenges that the service provider had. And so, again, they ended up working with each other on a very level playing field, understanding exactly what each other's challenges and opportunities were. And they worked with each other to defray those challenges and maximize the opportunities that were available. And it worked like a charm. It really did. It is a bit of a risk and a bit of a gamble. And most people don't think, oh, well, I don't know if I want to do that, but if I was to recommend to someone to do it, I would say definitely do it. It is really worthwhile what you get back out of it afterwards. Next slide, please, Collins. Making the best use of available services. And so your forwarder is your ally. We have sea, air, or a combination. So find out what options are available to your market. Direct services are better than transshipments all the time, but you need to think about the total cost concept, not just about the freight charges, but there are other issues as well. If you're taking indirect services, slow boats, for want of a better description, then you're going to pay for it. You may save 5 cents on freight, but what's the actual total value of the contract that you're supplying? So the longer the transport time, the more likely that your buyer is going to demand increased payment times. And that's going to lead to greater finance costs. So that's going to increase your risk, because the longer the product is traveling, the longer that it's in motion, the greater the risk that something could go wrong. But also it's going to reduce your profit, because you're going to have to offer extended payment terms. And money is not free. It costs whenever you're not getting money. However long your payment periods are, there's a financial implication in that one. And it's also got costs on your internal mechanisms in the organization in terms of your cash flows, etc. So people need to think beyond just the freight rate. So we've saved 5 cents on freight. Yeah, that's great, but it's cost you 20 cents in finance. So, and the other thing that you have, of course, is that the longer it takes for you to service a market, then the greater opportunities you're leaving to your competitors to come in and offer a better deal. Whenever you can, use the same carrier all the way through. Avoid a foreign carrier transfer on a foreign soil. because basically they say, oh, it's his fault, and we start the blame game. And that's not helpful at all. And from bitter experience in the past, using a carrier going into the United States, and I won't mention the carrier, and that carrier would take it to a particular place in the United States. The options were limited at the time, so there wasn't really too much choice in terms of using that particular carrier. And once it got to the States, at either Los Angeles or San Francisco, then it went on to a domestic carrier for further transport inland in the United States to its final airport of destination. And if anything was going to go wrong, it was going to go wrong in that transfer point between one airline and the next, and they both blamed each other for getting it wrong. It doesn't help, So where you can, and it's not always possible, but wherever you can, stick with the same letterhead. They can't blame anyone else. If anything goes wrong, then they're just going to have to wear it, and they're going to have to work out how to fix it or how to make a remedy. But otherwise, it's just people just run for cover. And don't compromise on your standards or specific requirements that customers may have, because that's the linchpin to making a successful transaction is to make sure that you get the product on time and the customer's happy. Next slide, please. Reconfiguring packing and order quantities. Sometimes we have packaging that we've been using for some time, and might be historical developments, etc. We're happy with those, things work, and we just leave them be as they are. But sometimes things may not be as good as they could be. Is your packing optimized? Do you have, for argument's sake, free buffers within your packing? If you're using air freight, you're either paying for weight or volume, whichever yields the greatest to the airline. So if you've got, air buffers within your packing, then you're taking up more volume than weight probably, and you're going to end up paying more for freight anyway. And so any unused space inside primary containers is likely to cost you money. And so examples that I've got, and I was involved in these, I can talk about these from personal experience because I drove these. Particular product that I had that I became the product manager for. When I took over that portfolio, I went down to the warehouse to look at the way that the product was packed, and I was aghast. There were 3 product boxes in a fairly large polystyrene container, and you could only fit 3 in there because of the way that they're being configured, the way that whoever the product manager was before had developed this sort of packaging, and it wasn't particularly good. I redesigned the packaging. The content of the it was a diagnostic kit, so with various reagents. So the content of the kit obviously didn't change because that was the product itself. But by reconfiguring it, I fitted 8 boxes instead of 3 inside the same outer container, and we saved a fortune on freight. We were no longer paying for volume rather than weight, and it worked out quite well. And it wasn't a difficult exercise. It was just a matter of sitting back and saying, okay, we need to look at this with fresh eyes, the fresh view, and to see what we can do in terms of optimizing what it is that we are sending out. And the other example that I've got out there is that reconfiguring the method of shipment. And so we used to send out product that needed to be stored frozen, so it was with dry ice, and the traditional things again took over that part of the portfolio from someone else, and the way that things were being shipped out was dry ice inside each box to keep the product cold. And I got together with the logistics providers, and we put our thinking caps together, and we sort of said, well, we all know that cold works downwards, not upwards. So in theory, we ought to develop something that just has a layer of ice at the top that keeps everything cold. So in conjunction with an airline that was quite cooperative and quite receptive, we ended up working out the method by which we could do this. And we ended up saving quite a lot of money, but also we ended up actually being more agile in the way that we were able to send the product to our customers because there are dry ice limits in each cargo hold of the aircraft. And the way that we ended up reconfiguring the unit load device actually meant that we were always below the maximum dry ice opportunities in the cargo hold. And so we no longer had any limitations. So we achieved not only some freight savings, but we also achieved greater opportunities to use any airlines to any of the destinations that we wanted, whereas before we really struggled to get those accepted because of the excessiveness of the dry ice that was being used. And all that it required in reality was just a bit of lateral thinking and a bit of help from the logistics providers and the airline. So we came up with a system where we would line the unit load device with bubble wrap on the inside and then thick layer of polystyrene, and then the product would go in there. In actual fact, what happened is we did not do the configuring of the ULD ourselves. We've got the freight forwarder to do that because they're much better at doing that. They're experts in that area. And we got them to line the ULD, take it to the warehouse, put it into the -20 freezer, make sure that the ULD was frozen in inverted commas, so it was brought into the temperature that the product needed to travel at, and then we would put the product inside the lined ULD container in the freezer. So the store people were working in a cold environment. And then we would have a refrigerated vehicle picking that up straight out to the airport, straight into the freight forwarder's premises freezer compartments. And then they had a 24/7 operation. At the last minute, they would deliver to the airline, and then the airline would carry it, get to the other end. Everything worked out perfectly. And at the other end, the material was still rock hard frozen, and the customers were very pleased with all of that. Next slide, please. Rethinking risk management. So the Incoterms 2020 are a good risk management tool, and you can provide options for the apportionment of costs within each one. Careful what you choose. So E&F terms, they've got little cost associated with them, but not so for C&D terms. With E&F terms, the risk transfers from seller to buyer in the exporting nation, so that's just pretty limiting in terms of what the exporter is exposed to. Freight cost may be incorporated into your sales price, and if you're providing credit to your buyer, you're effectively subsidizing the cost of freight. Average payment terms around the world in international trade are typically between 90 and 120 days, but forwarders and carriers want their money well before then. So if you're going into C&D terms, with carriage paid to, carriage and insurance paid to, cost and freight, cost insurance and freight, etc., and any of the delivered terms, DAPs, DPUs, DDPs, etc., you're paying for the freight up front. But there's a finance cost involved in that if you're paying for the freight up front and the carrier wants either payment immediately or payment within 7 days or even 30 days, and you're not getting the money from the customer 90 to 120 days, there is a finance cost in there. It may be hidden in your books, but in reality, it's still there. And the higher the freight rate to sales value ratio it is, the higher the impact of those finance costs. Be certain about what cost you're agreeing to pay. For C terms, sea freight charges additional to the freight rates are not unusual. Double dipping may occur where you've got unloading charges that are part of the carriage contract, but if a buyer's not aware of them, if they're not told that the unloading's already in it, then the stevedore at the other end is going to charge them again. And so your product becomes more expensive for the buyer, and the buyer won't know. If they're not told that the unloading is already part of it, it's not so much of an issue with air freight because it's all included, but with sea freight, it is a problem there. For D terms, do you really know the costs? Freight rates are only part of the problem. If you're looking at DDP transactions and you've got delays at customs or other bottlenecks at arrival ports, you might be liable for the extra demurrage costs. And that goes straight to your bottom line. And you need to update your force majeure clauses in the COVID-19 environment. You really, really need to make sure that you can get out of contracts or you have avoidance of late delivery fees, etc., in situations where COVID-19 environment and situations have caused product delivery delays or not just in terms of you being able to make the product, make it available, but also in terms of the transport things. So you need to review those, revise those. As I said before in previous sessions, there is no standard force majeure clause. Force majeure is really designed to give you relief from what you identify are causes beyond your control. And if you want to literally translate force majeure, it's a major force, meaning something beyond your control, something you're not contributing to, something you're not controlling, but it is preventing you from discharging your obligations under the contract that's been executed and you've entered into and agreed to. And so things like the COVID environment, you need to think about, okay, am I going to have any product delays? So if there are any product delays that are beyond my control because I can't source supply, for argument's sake, because there's no ships coming into the country, or there's only 2 aircraft when there were 25 before, then those issues need to be forming part of your force majeure. If you're late in delivering because of capacity constraints on the transport side of things, supply lines are, bottlenecked, it's just clogged up somewhere, that needs to be part of your force majeure clause.